Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's book-to-show comparison for the Expanse Season 2, Episode 6, Paradigm Shift. This video is part of a series of videos where I compare episodes of the Expanse TV show to that of its source material, pointing out the differences and giving my opinions on how well I think these adaptations work. So I have to start with a spoiler warning for the Expanse up to the end of Season 2. However, if you have not read the novels, that's all good. I won't spoil anything that may happen in future seasons of the show. However, if you plan on reading the novel someday, I will spoil what happens in Book 2 that was different from what occurred in the show, as that's the whole point of these videos. So, our episode begins with a flashback to 127 years ago, where we get to see a Martian in the early days of Mars colony go on a trip with his new ship. And this is done through voiceover narration about him wanting to test his experimental drive, and the sequence ends with him revealing that his name is Solomon Epstein, and that he changed everything. So those familiar with the show will recognize his name from the Epstein drive, which is the means of propulsion all ships in the Expanse use to get around the solar system so fast. So to my knowledge, nothing like this is in the novels, unless there's like a short story out there that I'm not aware of, but it wasn't in the main book series, that's for sure. And likewise, I don't think this should have been in the main TV show series either. Every time I watch these scenes, they feel more like DVD extra or webisodes, which is what they should have been, quite frankly, as what happens in these scenes are completely irrelevant to the rest of the episode and have nothing to do with anything. It doesn't add anything to the episode at all. Yes, it does give some texture to the Expanse universe, sure, but that's exactly the kind of thing that DVD extras and webisodes do, and the kind of people who usually like information like this tend to seek out these extra material. Forcing the casual viewer to watch this, which adds zero to the storyline at hand, was a very bad decision in my opinion. I mean, when I first saw this, I wasn't even sure what the Epstein drive was, let alone did I care one little bit about its origins. And the whole scene with the voiceover narration feels like a TED Talk or an infomercial, particularly when he says, "My name is Solomon Epstein and I changed everything." It sounds so cheesy and doesn't fit with the tone of the show, so I'm going to give this a -5. So next we get a scene at the UN headquarters, which I previously referred to as a war room. However, they aren't talking about war here so much, but what's going on with the crash site of Eros on Venus. UN science advisor to the military, Colonel Janus, has talks about this as he speculates on what happened with Eros. But Avasarala doesn't seem too impressed and just says that he's stringing a bunch of science words together to sound cool. Janus speculates that it was a Martian weapon, but Avasarala doesn't seem convinced. A scientist comes in a bit late that Janus refers to as Dr. Iturbi, and he scolds him for being late, but Iturbi doesn't seem to care. So, I'll actually get into Iturbi a little bit later as we meet him in another scene, but to my knowledge, Janus didn't appear in the books and is a character invented for the show. We never get a scene like this. However, there was a conference call in the novels that involved Avasarala, Aaron Wright, and Secretary General Gillis, where they did speculate on what the protomolecule on Venus was up to, but that call was more about the incident in Ganymede, which in the show hasn't occurred yet. As in the novels, there was a year time jump between books 1 and 2, so we never actually get to see the immediate follow-up to the Eros incident. The first time we meet Avasarala or any other UN official, it's a year after the incident occurred. But this does make sense that the UN officials would be behaving this way, so I'll give this a +1. Next, we go back to the Rosnate, where we see Holden sending a letter to his mother saying that there's some things that he can't say because his communications will be monitored, but lets her know that he's okay and that he and his crew just saved Earth, and he hopes that she gets to meet them one day one person in particular, and then he looks over to Naomi. Now, again, this scene takes place right after the Eros incident, but in the novels there was a year gap, so we didn't get a scene like this. So then we see Naomi and Holden cuddle in bed and talk about the Eros incident and how nobody has any idea what the protomolecule is, and then Naomi reasons out that Holden wants to destroy their sample of the protomolecule to stop it from spreading. So in the novels, as I covered in the previous video, Holden no longer has a sample of the protomolecule, as he has already given it to Fred Johnson in exchange for his help during the Eros incident. So this is a non-issue in the books, but either way this is fine, so I'll give this a 0. So next we get a scene where Holden and Naomi had gathered Alex and Amos in the mess hall so Holden can reveal to them that he is sleeping with Naomi in the interest of being open and honest and making sure that they don't have an issue with this. While he reveals this, he tries to read them to make sure they're okay with this, and when it looks like Amos will get upset, he asks Holden when this started. So he answers that it started after Eros, and Amos nods and then bursts out into laughter and smiles, and he gloats over Alex, saying that he knew it, as apparently he and Alex already knew about Holden and Naomi, and they had a bet of when it started, and Amos won. So he won the right to punch Alex in the arm, and as Alex braces himself for Amos, he instead gives him a wet willy, and Alex is even more upset over that. After Naomi and Alex leave the room, Holden stays behind to make sure Amos is completely okay with this, as he knows that he and Naomi were really close. Amos says that he thinks it's fine because he thinks of Naomi more as a sister, but he does say, "Don't get me wrong, I'd do her if she'd let me," which kind of puzzles and freaks out Holden, who simply says, "I'm glad we had this talk," and Amos just slaps him on the shoulder and leaves. Now, this is similar to a scene in the novels. However, in that case, they're eating dinner together right after Holden and Naomi first hooked up, and Holden tries to be casual about it and not give away that they slept together. But when he asks Naomi to pass the salt, Amos is suddenly like, "Hey, you two are sleeping together." And Alex had no idea, but Amos spotted it immediately. Holden tries to make sure that it won't be an issue, but every time he starts to speak, Amos interrupts him and tells him that it's fine, it doesn't matter, him and Alex will be okay with it, while the whole time Naomi is laughing hysterically. In the novels, this happened before the Eros incident and right after they started sleeping together, so there wasn't time for Alex and Amos to have a bet on when it started like there was here. But I really like both of these scenes, and I think they both work, so I'll give this a 0. So we then cut back to someone, Epstein, as he's trapped on a ship, going at high speeds for the first time. But since he had disabled the voice command because it wasn't working, he's unable to stop the ship. So this segment is all about how his life is in jeopardy because the high speeds will kill him, and he's trying to stop it. But this is a giant waste of time, in my opinion, as he doesn't stop it, so what's the point of seeing him try to stop it? I still don't know why we're seeing this at all, so -5. So next we cut back to present times, where on Earth Avasarala is having dinner with Dr. Michael E. Turby, an eccentric scientist with a unique way of looking at things. Now, there is no character in the novels with that name, but the character that it seems to be loosely based on is the character in the novels named Michael John de Utarbe, which I'm probably pronouncing wrong, but just go with it. So some speculate the name was simplified to make it easier to say, maybe for people like me. But Michael John Utarbe was simply someone Avasarala was shown having one conversation with through an interlink, or whatever that's called, basically a Skype call, where Michael John Utarbe is her connection to what's happening on Venus, and he tells her what happened to the Abergast being torn apart and everyone on board dying, and he does it with such ease and detachment that it upsets Avasarala, who has finding a really hard time to try to hide the fear and sadness that she feels. So that character barely appeared in the books, and Avasarala didn't really care for him, but Dr. Turby appears in the show a bit more as he's given his own storyline, and Avasarala appears to have a fondness for him. In fact, one one could even consider it cosmic justice that Michael John Uterbe's show counterpart ends up dying in the incident that he was being so insensitive about. But ultimately, I must say I liked what they did with this character in the show so much more. He's eccentric, he's interesting, it adds a lot. I do feel his introduction here was rather sudden and they didn't do that much with him, but still thought this was a big improvement, so I'll give this a +3. So you see some of Uterbe's charm as he pretty much hits on Avasarala, who turns him down, but he is unfazed, saying you can't blame a guy for trying. I think perhaps he wasn't being totally serious and was just trying to flatter her. However, Uterbe brings up the possibility of what happened on Eros was involved with something extra solar. In other words, he's not saying it's aliens, but it's aliens. So he's a bit more out of the box than the other eggheads are. He begs Avasarala to pull the strings to get him on the Abergast, which is going to Venus, so he can prove his theories correct. In return, he promises to be her eyes and ears on the Abergast because Ehrenreich is trying to lock her out of what's going on there. Now, this is interesting because in the novels it's kind of the other way around. Ehrenreich gives her the sole responsibility of being in charge of the study on Venus and the Abergast mission in order to distract her from what's going on with the Mars negotiations. And the show hasn't begun this Ganymede incident in the Mars negotiations yet. That hasn't happened yet. But that is fascinating that her position regarding Venus is the exact opposite as it was in the books. I think I like the show's way better, as I like her having to have to plant a man on the ship, and I'm glad that later on she's more involved in the Mars negotiations, so I'm going to give this a +2. So then we see the Rosinante crew arrive on Tycho to cheering crowds and that celebrate them as heroes. So in the novels, we never see them arrive on Tycho after the Eros incident, as book 1 ends with the Eros incident, and there's an epilogue about Fred Johnson attending a peace conference with Earth and Mars, and Holden is there too. And then at the start of book 2, we see Holden, who is now fully working for Fred Johnson and the OPA, and he's out hunting pirates. In fact, when he introduces himself to the pirates, he introduces himself as James Holden of the OPA. As I said, about a year has passed, and after Holden takes care of some pirates, he gets a call from Fred Johnson, and in the next chapter that he's in orbit of Ganymede, preparing to go to Ganymede. So we never get him visiting Tycho after the Eros incident. Unlike the show, he does visit Tycho after his mission to Ganymede, which he doesn't do in the show. So in the show, doing things out of order, and taking many events from his post-Ganymede visit to Tycho, and then plants it here before he goes to Ganymede. But honestly, either way is fine, so I'm going to give this a 0. So Holden and Naomi go straight to Fred Johnson's office to inform him that some of the UN missiles sent to destroy Eros are missing, but Johnson seems unconcerned and reveals that he purposely disabled the missile self-destruct mechanisms so that he could steal them, and even goes as far as to ask for Naomi's help in reprogramming them. Holden isn't at all happy about this, and this is when the rift starts to form between Holden and Johnson. So in the novels, as I mentioned, a lot of time has passed between the books, and so what happened to the missiles is never addressed. It's assumed that Johnson gave them back to the UN during these negotiations. So in the novels, this is a non-issue that's never addressed. And to be honest, I have mixed feelings on this one. As on one hand, I do find this whole storyline about the missiles unnecessary and distracting, and I kind of like how this wasn't addressed at all in the novels, but on the other hand, this does set up for a nice payoff with the missiles in season 3 that I really liked. So given my mixed feelings, I think I'll give this a 0. So next we get a scene with Alex and a bar telling stories of what it was like flying the Rossi during the Eros mission, and the 4 women seem really impressed by him. After all, he is a hero. One of them is a little too impressed and kisses him just as her angry boyfriend walks in, and he doesn't take too kindly to her behavior and starts to choke her. When Alex tries to intercede on her behalf, he turns his attention to him and starts beating him up, but then Amos appears out of nowhere and completely kicks the guy's guy's ass. Alex doesn't seem too pleased about this. The girl immediately starts hanging on Amos, but he puts her back to Alex, but he doesn't seem too interested. Now, to my knowledge, nothing like this occurred in the novels. It's said that Alex and Amos hit the bars hard, and Amos hits the brothels. But since neither of these characters are viewpoint characters in the books, and at least in book 1 or 2, we never see specifics on what this entails. I kind of like this scene, so I'll give it a +1. So then Fred Johnson goes on the Rocinante to confront Holden about how it appears they stopped out in the belt somewhere after the Eros, after they went to Eros, for some unknown reason, and he's suspicious. Holden tells him about how Amos killed Miller's friend and that they took time so that Miller could give his friend a proper send-off. But we know that's not true, and that it was really him hiding their sample of the protomolecule. And I think Fred Johnson suspects Holden is hiding something as well. He tries to convince him they're on the same team, but Holden rejects the whole concept of teams, saying the UN, the MCRN, and the OPA is all a bunch of crap, and people just need to come together and forget about teams. Johnson just dismisses this as pie-in-the-sky idealism, and that realistically Holden needs to choose a side. So first off, again, at this stage in the novels, Holden has already given Johnson the protomolecule. Although in book 1, Johnson did find out that Holden was hiding a sample and he threatened to take it by force. But in that case, he knew for certain. But Miller was still around and he was able to talk him out of it. And as for Holden needing to choose a side, as I mentioned in the novels, he did in fact pick a side. He was officially part of the OPA. And frankly, I do find his pie-in-the-sky idealism unrealistic here, and I find this confrontation kind of uninteresting, so I'm going to give this a -1. So then we go back 127 years again to see Epstein speeding to his death, and he makes one last-ditch effort to stop the ship and by trying to get his hand terminal, but it fails, and the terminal smashes, so he's doomed to die. And as we see later on, he does. So what's the point of this scene? Why do I care? Answer is I don't. -5. So next we get a scene of Naomi entering Fred Johnson's office and asking him to put it out there that Miller and Julie Mal are heroes that saved Earth in order to paint the belt in a positive light. When Naomi says Miller was a good man, Fred counters by saying that he was a pain-in-the-ass suicidal ex-cop, but then adds who got the job done. So Fred agrees to tell Miller's story. Now, nothing like this happened in the novels because, as I said, we don't follow Naomi nor Fred Johnson right after Eros, and for that matter, no follow-up is really given on how Miller is perceived, as Book 2 has moved on from Miller, and the next time we see the Rocinante on Tycho is after the Ganymede incident, so they've already moved on to bigger things. But I do really like this scene, as it was a nice touch that Naomi would want to honor her friend Miller. But more than that, it shows she's politically savvy, and doing so would put the belt in a positive light. It's also establishing a rapport between her and Fred Johnson, which will come into play later in the show. So overall, I really like this, so I'll give it a +3. So next we get a scene of Holden having a meeting with his crew about how he wants to destroy their sample of the protomolecule. He brings up that Fred Johnson is trying to get all the information he can from Kotasar about the protomolecule so he can use it in order to gain power. So it's too dangerous to leave their sample out where anyone might find it. Naomi counters that Fred's trying to do what's best for the belt, but Holden simply says, or so he claims. Alex then brings up the possibility of giving the protomolecule to Mars, as the Martians are the only ones so far with their hands clean, but Naomi and Amos are both very much against the idea. Holden says that no one power can get the protomolecule because that would give them an advantage that they will eventually use, so the only real solution is to destroy it. Naomi brings up the possibility that there could be other samples out there, but Holden counters that when Dresden lost the Anubis, it stopped them right in their tracks until they found Julie Mal. So They just may have the last remaining sample of the protomolecule. So Amos and Alex agree to destroy it by driving it into the sun. So first off, there's a few things we know from later episodes that shed light on this conversation. First of all, they don't have the last sample of the protomolecule, as Jules Pierre Mal has more of it that he's currently using to create a protomolecule hybrid creatures intended as weapons. Also, Mars is supporting this endeavor and will shortly do a lot of really shady shit to try to cover this up, including letting their own soldiers die. So we know that Alex's suggestion about giving the protomolecule to Mars is not a good one. Now, as far as the novels are concerned, as I mentioned already, it seemed like this never took place because, at this stage, Holden has already given the protomolecule sample to Fred Johnson. However, in the novels, Holden also believes that their sample is the last one, as when they discovered the protomolecule hybrids on Ganymede, Holden automatically assumes that this must have come from Fred Johnson's sample. But overall, I don't care for the tribalism in this scene, with Naomi wanting to give the protomolecule to the Belt because she's a Belter, and Alex wanting to give the protomolecule to Mars because he's a Martian. These characters would not have behaved like this in the books, and I feel it kind of cheapens their characters, so I'm going to give this a -2. So then we see Naomi and her council prepared to shoot the protomolecule into the sun, and Holden comes up and reassures her that she's doing the right thing. She fires off the missile into the flight plan that leads into the sun, or at least so it appears. After Holden leaves, Naomi gives an evil look, and it's revealed that she did in fact not fire off the missile with the protomolecule, and the protomolecule is still in hiding. Now again, you know what I'm going to say. Didn't happen in the novels, and this sets off a chain of events that will differ the show from the books a lot going forward. At first, I think I would say I didn't like it, but then seeing where the show went with this, it does make sense and allowed them to do some things different from the book. So I wouldn't say this is better or worse than the books, just different, so I'll give it a 0. So, then we get yet another scene of Solomon Epstein hurtling towards his death over his narration, and then we see him die, as his narration points out that the most common way to die at such high G acceleration is a stroke. But then his voiceover goes on to describe how his drive, the Epstein drive, would go on to give Mars the power to become independent from Earth and to explore and colonize the Belt. And this is the thing about technology, it changes everything. And thus, we are given our loose, very loose connection to the rest of the episode that technological advancements change everything, which connects to the discovery of the protomolecule and how this is going to change everything. That is a very loose connection indeed, and I still say these would have been much better as DVD extras or webisodes and would have made the same commentary then, as it doesn't directly connect to anything happening in this episode, just the protomolecule in general. And I find it incredibly cheesy to hear voiceover narration from a dead guy speaking beyond the grave about what happens after he dies. That's just dumb. So, -5. Next, we get an absolutely amazing visual sequence where we see Jupiter and pan over and zoom over to Ganymede to see Bobby Draper and her team patrolling the outer reaches of the settlement there. This is one of the best visual effects in space that I've seen, and it really feels like you're there on Ganymede in orbit of Jupiter. As you see her team standing in the ice craters where Jupiter looms overhead, gives you a real sense of what it would be like to be there, and I think this sequence is severely underrated and undersold. In dialogue, we learn that Draper and her team are there patrolling a shared UN and Mars facility where the UN has their side and Mars has their side, and they both patrol their own borders to make sure neither one breaches their side. Draper takes this assignment as a slight, as she calls it, farm duty. Now, this was also pretty much the case in the novels, as Ganymede was divided by the UN and Martian property, although it was explained in the novels because up until the events of Book 1, Earth and Mars were still allies and did everything in joint ventures, but that changed with the Dollinger incident, and they began to split up all the colonies, but neither one wanted to give up Ganymede because of its importance as the breadbasket of the belt, so they split it up instead, whereas in the show, Earth and Mars had been in a Cold War for years. However, it could be inferred that something similar happened where they agreed to split up Ganymede, that it just happened much longer ago. But I must say, I absolutely love the visuals in this scene. I think it makes a huge difference to be able to see it rather than just reading words on a page. So I'm going to give this a +4. We then go to Avasarala, where she goes to Aaron Wright and tells him that Jules Pierre Mao was responsible for Eros. Aaron Wright protests and asks if she really thinks that he'd want Earth to be destroyed, but she explains that he's probably just dealing with powers that he doesn't understand and can't control. Avasarala then tells Aaron Wright to offer amnesty to Jules Pierre Mao in exchange for cooperation. Aaron Wright asks if she'll think he'll go for it, and Avasarala replies by saying, well, if he doesn't, that she will burn him and his family to the fucking ground. She talks about how she can't be bought, and by the time they maneuver to try to remove her, it will be too late, and that he and his entire family will lose everything. They will be pariahs, outcasts, on the run from the law, and tells Aaron Wright to be sure to tell Jules Pierre Mao that. So I think it's evident that she knows Aaron Wright is working with Mao, and I think Aaron Wright knows it now as well. This scene was absolutely amazing, one of the best Avasarala moments where she really lays down the law. Now, although no specific scene like this exists in the books, it's kind of implied. When Avasarala meets with Mao, she asks him for any information on the protomolecule, and when he says he has none to give her, she warns him that this is his last chance, and if she discovers that he's holding anything back, she'll ruin him. Also in the books is described how Avasarala can't be bought, and that's why Aaron Wright tries to isolate her. But neither was as great as this scene was, which was just simply amazing. So I want to give this a +5. So next we get a scene of Amos defacing the Martian flag, or as he calls it, updating it, where he is erasing the moon demos from the flag and replacing it with a bunch of small rocks, since the UN blew up Demos. Alex takes offense to this as a Martian. Amos offers to let Alex punch him, but then Alex realizes that it's Amos's way of apologizing to Alex, as Alex is still upset over Amos saving him from the fight earlier. Amos insists that there are several types of people, and Alex is the type of person that needs to be protected. And despite Amos saying that there's no shame in this, this only angers Alex, and he storms off. Now, nothing like this happens in the books, and Amos never defaced the Martian flag, although I do like how this comes up later in the show. However, I felt this little fight between Amos and Alex was really unnecessary and doesn't really come into play later, so I'm going to give this a -1. So next we get a scene where Drummer is trying to take control of the UN missiles, and Naomi comes up and gives her tips on how to do it. Drummer is surprised a member of Holden's crew is helping her, but Naomi says that both need to look out for one another, and so she continues to help her reprogram the missiles. This was a nice little scene as it shows the friendship between Drummer and Naomi beginning to blossom, which will be very important friendship indeed. Now, as I surely mentioned before, Drummer wasn't in the novels at this stage, but there was another character named Sam, an engineer on Tycho who later appeared on the Behemoth in Book 3, who was close friends with Naomi, and they obviously are blending that friendship in here, and I like that. Plus, this is a good subtle foreshadowing of the direction Naomi's heading in, and that of being more loyal to the belt, and the fact that she will eventually give the protomolecule to the OPA, so I'll give this a +2. So we then go back to the beautiful shots on Ganymede where Draper and her team are on standard patrol and are in contact with their CEO, Lieutenant Sutton, when they see a drone fly overhead and are at first dismissive of it as routine, but then their communications get blocked as they start being jammed. And when they look across to the UN line, the UN soldiers are no longer on standard patrol and appear to be charging their position. So we then see Sutton in orbit trying to reestablish communications with Draper and her team, but to no avail, and then the ships begin firing at one another in orbit. When Draper sees this, she orders her men to take a defensive position against the charging UN force. We then see Sutton and his Marines on the ship get killed by RPG fire, and an orbital mirror explodes. We then cut back, it then cuts to black, and then we fade in on Draper's team lying dead on the ground as they've been ripped to shreds. But Draper herself is still alive, but not in good shape as she's lying on the ground, barely able to move, and her helmet is cracked. She looks up and sees what could be described as a blue monster looming over her, and then she blacks out. Now, when I first saw this scene, I found it very confusing and didn't really get what was going on, but this was before I read the book. After I read the book, I got what was going on, but saw this as a giant cop-out. Either way, it was poorly executed. As in the novels, this was a much more longer and more involved sequence, and this was in fact the first time in the novels that we met Bobby Draper, where her and her team were out on patrol when communications started being blocked. She and her team returned to the Martian compound where there were more Martian Marines, and they were behind a barricade, they were behind barriers, and they were waiting for the incoming UN attack. They even had a giant mech gun that they named Yojimbo. And when the UN soldiers got closer, they could clearly see the protomolecule killing them. And as soon as Bobby saw the protomolecule hybrid rip one of the UN soldiers in half, she started firing at it, and all the other Marines started firing at it as well, and it did virtually nothing, barely even slowed it down. And after it killed the UN Marines, it turned to the Martians, and was a much more involved sequence, which I won't get into all the details, but involved the protomolecule hybrid ripping people's heads off and stuff like that. And this all happened in very clear view of Draper, who wasn't the tiniest bit confused about what was going on. And when it had her pinned, she ran out of ammo, and it just looked at her with curiosity. But then something happened, and it exploded, propelling her backwards. Now, it's kind of implied that it exploded here, but like many things in this scene, it wasn't really clear. And I know the next episode will explore more of what happened, but it's implied it was more of a blur and Bobby didn't really get what was going on, whereas in the books, she very clearly saw it as a monster that was killing people and ripping them in half, and she knew for a fact that the UN soldiers were not charging them but running away from this monster that was killing them. So simply cutting to black and saying and then fading it in after her team's already died is a bit of a cheat, and I feel robbed of an amazing sequence. Now granted, this could have to do with budget restraints, but they did spend some money on showing us the space battles, where I think the money would have been better spent showing us the ground battles. And you may say they were doing this to make it more mysterious or more unclear on who really attacked them, but I don't think that they should have. I think the way the book did it, by making it crystal clear what was going on, was far more interesting setup and much more dynamic, so I'm going to give this a -4. So my final adaptation score for Paradigm Shift is a -7. Look, this isn't a bad episode. There are a lot of things I like about this episode. A few things I love, like Avasarala's rant about bringing hellfire down on Jules Pierre Mount. That was amazing. But this isn't a particularly good adaptation overall. A few things were handled poorly, like the hybrid attack on Draper's Marines. And as they always do, they try to raise the tensions between the Rossi crew when it's not really necessary. But most of all, those ridiculous Solomon Epstein scenes scenes were a complete waste of time, although I wouldn't have minded them. To be clear, I would have actually liked these scenes if they were bonus material where they belonged, but they did not belong in the episode. Although I wouldn't say this is a bad episode, it is probably the weakest one of Season 2, which is one of my favorite seasons of television of all time. So that's it for my book-to-show comparison for The Expanse Season 2, Episode 6. I'll be back with my book-to-show comparison for Episode 7 of Season 2 in about a month. In the meantime, you can check out my channel for many other Expanse videos, as well as other videos and other shows like Game of Thrones, Star Trek, Babylon 5, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. Thanks a lot for watching.